Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Luther Konadu. I'm the assistant curator here at Plugin ICA. Thank you all for joining us today. Today's program continues our lecture series, which is part of the solo exhibition for Judy Riddall. Our guest speaker for today is David Biddle. His talk is titled Facing the Disintegration of the Human Face. Before I go ahead, I'd like to spend some time to give my respect and reverence to the First Nations peoples whose resources and stolen land I live and work on today. We're on Treaty 1 territory. It's a territory belonging to a diverse range of Indigenous communities who've been stewards of these lands for many, many centuries before recorded history and colonial contact. Some of these Indigenous communities include the Anishinaabe, Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dakota, the Dene peoples, as well as the national homeland of the Red River Métis. The water that we drink and make use of every day in this city is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nations Reserve, which is on the border between Manitoba and Ontario, about 2 hours from here. As I already indicated, our speaker for today is David Biddle, and his lecture will examine the ontological status of faces in general and of the human face in particular within the context of a technosphere which incessantly generates and circulates images of the face. And he's been doing this referencing thinkers like Jose Ortega y Gasset, Octavia Butler, Bernard Stiegler, among others. Biddle is an interdisciplinary artist and scholar, and he's in his third year of his PhD at Simon Fraser University, currently in Vancouver. His work integrates text, sound, moving image, performance, and his scholarship, which is indistinguishable from his art practice, synthesizes research in theological biology, theoretical biology, philosophy of mind, biosemiotics to produce pedagogical artifacts that evoke new metaphysics of life. Please help me welcome David.
Hello, check. Is that volume sound okay? Yes, of course. Need to step forward into the light. Thanks so much for the introduction, Luther. One thing I'm really interested in that will come up today, maybe, hopefully, is the possibility for typos to become meaningful. And we've talked a bit about contingency becoming necessity. And Luther, in your reading that bio, you said theological biology. And I've never used that term, but it's really beautiful. And I'll probably make an amendment on my bio to say theological biology instead of theoretical biology. So thanks for having me here, Judy, and everybody at Plugin, and everybody at the Winter Institute. It's nice to be here to speak. There's sort of two talks happening. There's this one in the dimension of all the fleshy portals, and then there's this other talk happening, and they're both happening at the same time. I'm really happy to be here, and it's interesting because they warned me not to come. You know, they said, colleagues, they said, you can't talk about that, it's career suicide. They warned me not to come here. But I'm happy to be here anyway, because my talk today is called Facing the Disintegration of the Human Face. And you know, they warned me that trying to talk about the difference between faces and images of faces is career suicide. It's the one thing you don't do. You know, I was getting on the airplane to come here, and my colleagues were at the gate, and they were saying, "Don't do it, Dave. You're a public lecturer. You're a serious public lecturer. This is career suicide." And I said I didn't understand why, and they said, "There's the one thing you can't do. You can't talk about the difference between a face and an image of a face." But I'm here anyway, and so I'm going to talk about that. But it's not really what I'm talking about, so it's okay, because it may be, you know, I was warned that it's probably the last public lecture I'll ever give, if that's the topic. And so if that's the case, then I'm happy to, this may be my last public lecture, in which case I'm going to try and talk about everything that I know, or at least that I'm interested in. And a lot of that has to do with, so I'll try to give, just for the space here, I'll try to give a bit of a, without looking at any kind of notes, I'd like to kind of evoke a sense of the trajectory of where I want to go in the talk today. Because there's kind of two talks happening, like I said. So in one way, my research interests are resonating a lot with some of the previous speakers, Cecile and Tom, who both are addressing things, you know, like repetition, the difference between repetition and recursivity, let's say. And this is an acceptable difference to address. This is not career suicide. You know, the difference between signal and noise, this is a difference that is an interesting one to address. But for some reason, the difference between a face and an image of a face is just something that you're not really allowed to touch. But it's interesting because it's a difference that's sort of formally implicit in almost every conversation or every public discourse in contemporary life. There is the question of a difference between a face and an image of a face. To get there, which I know I shouldn't be doing, I'm going to kind of talk about some other research interests. So I'm sort of interested in an ontology of constraints. That's sort of at the furthest distance, maybe the way I would characterize where I want to get to. And this addresses sort of a topic that I think is necessarily interdisciplinary in the most radical sense, because where, you know, it's sort of where theoretical biology meets theological biology. There's, in theoretical biology, I'm interested in the areas of, you know, theoretical biology, systems theory, cybernetics, the historical developments of thermodynamics, the entropy concept, information theory. And in these fields, there's a history that I have come to understand, particularly maybe through the work of Erwin Schrödinger, which looks at the elimination of sentience from, or interiority, from the causality of life, of how we understand life and living systems, and just phenomena in general. There's been a process starting in sort of the mid-1800s, or earlier, with the Carnot heat engine, is sort of an instantiation of the theory, and then it was more made explicit through people like Ludwig Boltzmann and in the 1850s, where an understanding of the world through microstates was privileged over an understanding of the world in macrostates, or maybe we would call it the phenomenological world, the world that we encounter and we take for granted, where there are entities and objects and beings that we take for granted as having some sort of ontological existence. There's sort of a trajectory in the history of Western science that you can follow where that realm was eliminated or subordinated or made secondary or illusory, and the realm of microstates was privileged so that things could be statistically analyzed and outcomes and general, I guess the telos of all material systems could be understood in terms of like a statistical analysis of probabilities of microstates over time. I'll talk more about that, but instead of going too deep into that, I want to talk about some people who, that's been a problem in philosophy and in systems theory and something that people have been dealing with, and I think both of the other speakers so far have addressed. Someone who I really am interested in right now that I'd like to sort of acknowledge is Alicia Herrero, and I love books, and I always have books with me because I have this bad memory, and so books are always with me, and they feel like they're part of my cognitive process. So I have this book called Context Changes Everything, How Constraints Create Coherence by Alicia Herrero. Came out in 2023. I'm mentioning it because I'm just going to give really quick overviews of what ideas come up in that and how they're interesting to me as someone theoretically interested in this field, and then also how artists, I think, can take up the topics and actually kind of need to. And there's a need for an interdisciplinarity in this field. So what is the constraint? I guess in Alicia Herrero's book, there's a way of thinking about introducing a new regime of causality. So if we go way back to the very mechanistic understanding of physical systems through the entropy concept, we have one mode of causality. It's the Aristotelian efficient cause. And I think actually Tom yesterday mentioned exactly this phrase. It's like the billiard ball-like interaction where all forces are exchanged through this kind of encounter that can be measured through physical or chemical analysis. It's always an exchange of force from behind. And that leads to like a bottom-up causality. And that became kind of, through the ubiquity of the entropy concept, seemingly the most effective and fundamental causal understanding of the world. And sort of the basis then of like how the technosphere was developed. And the technosphere is maybe a term that a lot of people use. I'm kind of referencing Bernard Stiegler when I say the technosphere. And in a lot of ways, it's associated with the Anthropocene. The technosphere is basically this kind of emergent system of technologies that exists in a network of mutual constraints and reproductions. But it has its own implicit ontology, let's say. And what's been removed from, as I was saying in that history of thermodynamics, the removal of that kind of experiential world, the world of emergent properties and entities at the level of our experience, those are removed from the ontology that underlies the technosphere. So in a lot of ways we can come back to that and think about why we sometimes feel alienated by the goings-on of the technosphere. But then it's a complicated history because as Tom talked about yesterday, then there's kind of attempts through cybernetics and systems theory to introduce ways of understanding other types of causality that are not reducible to this billiard ball-like efficient cause. And cybernetics brings about this idea of maybe boundary conditions or like organizational principles that can bring about changes in a system that can't be understood purely in terms of their mechanistic interactions. I think Alicia Herrero goes really far in that with her articulation of constraints. And she's talking about how constraints create coherence at many different levels. And just to kind of keep the general overview going, so I won't go too deep into what she's saying there, but I think what's important for us, again, as artists, is at this point thinking of an ontology of constraints and how we might actually help participate and link up with this kind of modeling that's happening in the field of Herrera's in the field of dynamical systems theory, where there's an attempt to kind of show how an interdependence of relationships can generate and cultivate sort of like an ecology of meanings. And at different levels, there's kind of a closure of meanings. And you can look at it at the organismic level. So in terms of like an organological dynamic in an organism's body, it brings back the concept of meaning as an irreducible source of causality. And I think, talking about this history of thermodynamics, when we say we're getting that the phenomenological, the emergent has been, the experiential has been removed from our modeling of the world, what that essentially does in the mid-1800s is remove any sense of meaning in any kind of discourse or that has any relation to technology. And so there is a correlation between sort of like existentialism, the emergence of the existential crises that are associated with that time, and well, I think that those are ongoing, and I think that there are a lot of great projects that are trying to restore an understanding of meaning in these frameworks that we use. So, in a way, I think I want to get around to talking in more depth about Alicia Herrera's ontology of meaning as interdependence of constraints and coherence. I'm gonna have a sip of water here. And then, kind of simultaneously alongside that discussion, I'm going to be returning to this topic of the difference between a face and an image of a face. So maybe the thing to do, well, I'm going to read a quote from Schrödinger that might help summarize what I've talked about in this historical context, because that's the historical context within which we can understand the project that's taken up by Alicia Herrera and others that I'm talking about, which is an attempt to bring sort of meaning as a regime of causality back into our understanding of systems at all levels, dynamical systems that are living organisms, cultural systems, sociological systems. So on this historical kind of framing that I've addressed already, Schrödinger writes that although physicists have always dealt with models, prior to statistical mechanics, we thought we were dealing with the world itself. Expressions like model or picture for the conceptual constructs of science came up in the second half of the 19th century and not earlier. So that's the period that I think where we see the cultivation of thermodynamics, the entropy concept, and basically the primacy given to microstates as an explanatory model. So that's what allows statistical analysis to become the most kind of fundamental analysis of systems. And interestingly enough, there's a kind of a portal that opens up between this historical analysis and the difference between a face and an image of a face. Because along this same historical trajectory, we can find the invention of photograph within the same decade as the first articulation of the entropic principle in a technological instantiation, which again is called the Carnot heat cycle. So Schrödinger continues, we step with our own person back into the part of an onlooker who does not belong to the world, which by this very procedure becomes an objective world. This device is veiled by the following two circumstances. First, my own body, to which my mental activity is so very directly and intimately linked, forms part of the object, the real world around me, that I construct out of my sensations, perceptions, and memories. Secondly, the bodies of other people form part of this objective world. Now, I have very good reasons for believing that these other bodies are also linked up with, or are, as it were, the seats of spheres of consciousness. I can have no reasonable doubt about the existence of some kind of actualness of these foreign spheres of consciousness. Yet I have absolutely no direct subjective access to any of them. Hence, I am inclined to take them as something objective, as forming part of the real world around me. Moreover, since there is no distinction between myself and others, but on the contrary, full symmetry for all intents and purposes, I conclude that I myself also form part of this material world around me. I, so to speak, put my own sentient self, which had constructed this world as a mental product, back into it, with the pandemonium of disastrous logical consequences. We shall point them out one by one. For the moment, let me just mention the two most blatant antinomies due to our awareness of the fact that a moderately satisfying world picture has only been reached at the high price of taking ourselves out of the picture, stepping back in the role of a non-concerned observer. The first of these antinomies is the astonishment at finding our world picture colorless, cold, mute. Color and sound, hot and cold, are immediate sensations. Small wonder that they are lacking in a world model from which we have removed our mental person. The second is our fruitless quest for the place where mind acts on matter, or vice versa. The material world has only been constructed at the price of taking the self, that is mind, out of it, removing it. Mind is not part of it. Obviously, therefore, it can neither act on it nor be acted on by any of its parts. So lots of people have been interested in this problem, as I've said. One thinker that I'm very interested in, because obviously there's so much dualism implicit in a lot of this language, and that's been a struggle for, I think, theorists coming after this era to understand how to, rather than just simply run away from that duality or that dualistic epistemology, to understand it and overcome it. And there's a term called neutral monism that gets used, and there are neutral monists in different spheres. And neutral monism sort of refers to a thinker who doesn't give primacy to matter or mind, but sees them as two sort of emergent modes of causality that form the dynamics of the world in an epistemological sense, but are not, neither is primary over the other. What I mean by that is basically, I think our assumptions in a lot of cases are that we have this sort of material, physical universe, let's say, that interacts according to the laws of physics and these dynamics, and it's been addressed sort of whether this question of, well, is it a fortuitous sort of accident where by the laws of these physics, some sort of organization happens to come about that gives rise to a kind of structure that is able to look upon itself and start to then be susceptible to a new mode of causality, which would be sort of how we might think of the emergence of biological systems and things that can respond to difference in their environment, basically. Valent organizations of matter, meaning that there are these structures that have a value system that can acknowledge a gradient and transform their own being in response to that gradient, but that you can't understand those responses in terms of sort of that billiard ball causality. They're not these mechanized systems. All of a sudden, there's a new regime of causality that emerges, which we might call mind, that is sort of able to register difference in the environment as meaningful, and through some sort of metabolic process, turn that meaning into physical reinstantiation of itself in order to, reproduce itself. In the model of entropy that we get out of thermodynamics, there's this metaphysics that's implicit, which says basically there's a telos, there's a direction that the universe moves in, and that is the direction of, well, there's a lot of different ways of kind of making a sort of linguistic synonym for entropy for what it's doing. You hear disorder, you hear increased entropy is sort of the movement towards disorder, towards chaos, towards diffusion, towards freedom. And all of these, from my understanding and my research that's sort of outside of but related to the difference between a face and an image of a face, it sounds like these are all correlated with the phenomena of entropy increase in some way, but they do not actually stand in for it. And maybe the best way to understand entropy in the original sense is that it's a special type of probability increase. And so I'll quickly take a moment to talk about that, because this is an assumption that is built into this idea of mind emerging from matter and not the other way around. If we had a system that was a box, a big box like this, and it had a partition in the middle. This is the very simple kind of thermodynamic illustration of entropy. We had a partition in the middle, and we had two different types of gases. We had a red gas and a blue gas, and this partition in the middle was airtight. And according to the thermodynamic model, we might understand gas in a lot of ways. Smell, we would see it. It might make us feel dizzy, depending on what it is. There's a lot of phenomenological or experiential relationships we would have to gas. But an important thing in this model is that the first thing that has to happen for the development of thermodynamic understanding of a system like this is that you eliminate all those experiential relationships with the gas. And you just say that there are red molecules, and there are a bunch of discrete states they could be in each side, in the box, and there are blue molecules. And they move around randomly in individual bases, but the partition in the middle we would call a constraint. If we remove the constraint, all of a sudden, those two gases that were organized very discretely into separate states, and we could predict with certainty when the constraint's in place that a blue molecule will always be on one half of the box and a red molecule will always be on the other half. Once we remove that constraint, there's a natural process that happens that thermodynamics establishes that increases the probability distribution of the whole system. So the constraint has been an organizational principle until it's removed. And once it's removed, then all of a sudden the entropy can increase, because it will be a process of diffusion of the red and the blue. And what will happen, according to this model, is that over time, without any intervention, we will get this perfect distribution of red and blue. We will experience it as a purple gas. But we will understand that, according to thermodynamics, the final state of that gas, of that box, would be an equally distributed sort of randomly assortment of red and blue molecules. And that's where we can understand the term constraint. And so then, when we think of the universe as being kind of starting in that material dynamic where that's the fundamental principle of organization, we have to understand, well, or rather, it's been the struggle to understand how it is that that process alone, or that telos alone, could be responsible for somehow bringing about a state of organization that transcends that process of distribution and dissolution. So how can, within those very principles of distribution and dissolution, some fortuitous formation can emerge, which then, against that very telos, replicates itself. And the way it does that is through the organization of constraints. Now, I've gotten totally more technical than I wanted to right away. And that's what happens to me sometimes, especially when there are people in the room. So I'm going to turn my attention now to the other portal. And I know that there are people in this portal here, at least hypothetically or latently. And I'm here with you as well. So I want to address, for a moment, we're going to return to the entropy principle, but I want to address the difference between a face and an image of a face. And I understand the risks of this. I understand that the impact it'll have on my career, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. The way to do this is going to be a different theoretical, but related introduction of a theoretical model. But before I do that, I might ask, what is a face? I think that's something we take for granted. before I even get into anything, I'm just going to say what I think a face is, and this is something that's coming from my own face. What a face is, if we put it in maybe Kantian terms, we have the thing in itself which we can never access, the noumena. In my opinion is that the face, not the image of the face, but the face itself, is the one thing that we can encounter that is reality itself. It is not a production of reality, it is not a perceptual abstraction of reality, not a mediation. The face is the opening to the thing itself. And this makes faces necessary all over the place. So this kind of opening is necessary for the development of emergent systems, social systems, cultural systems, but also if we look deeper within, we'll find, and I'll talk about more, that there are faces at the levels of subsystems of bacteria. I'll talk about Lynn Margulis's work, who looked at the animal cell as actually made up of a bunch of once separately symbiotically coming together bacterium who all have their own faces. And the face represents a dimension of experiential being that can't be reduced to something phenomenological or something kind of perceptually an image of itself. It is the thing itself. Of course, the face, the image of the face, well, that's something we're surrounded by now, and I think we're starting to feel the tension of, or the dire consequences of mistaking an image of a face for a face. And this can come about when we assume that, as we might do in the Kantian sort of metaphysics or epistemology, that we can never encounter reality itself. We have these a priori filters. Well, I'd like to suggest that the face, and whatever we might come to define as a face, is reality itself. It breaks through that a priori filter. Thank you. It's not done, but thank you for that response. So I'm going to leave the theoretical. I'm going to come back to it shortly, but I want to talk a little bit about a work of science fiction that I really love, written by an author named Octavia Butler. The book is called Dawn. And I think that there's something, I'm going to introduce a theorist shortly after this called Michael Polanyi and his theory of attention. And our confusion of mistaking the face, or rather mistaking an image of a face for a face, this I see as part of a crisis of attention that, of course, is a larger crisis in many spheres of our lives. But I think if we come to understand the face as having this metaphysical status that I propose it does, then I think the worst thing that can come out of this crisis of attention that we are potentially living in right now is to mistake an image of a face for a face. So in Octavia Butler's novel Dawn, I'm just going to spoiler alert, I suppose, because it's a really great novel and I'm sure that some of you have read it and some it's on your list, but I'm just going to talk about the beginning, because in my opinion the beginning of this novel gives us this kind of allegory for the significance of the face that I'm talking about and the significance of how we might be able to restore, sentience or interiority into our map of the world that can be integrated with scientific models that have excluded it. And this is where artists are, of course, absolutely necessary. So in Octavia Butler's Dawn, we start off Earth in ruins. There's been a nuclear war, maybe a World War III, a nuclear apocalypse. It's totally unlivable. But there's this strange thing that's happened. Our main character, Lilith, wakes up after sort of being in this nuclear apocalypse, wakes up in this strange room that she can't recognize. She's all alone. She has experiences of waking up in there. Doesn't know where she is. And eventually she starts to kind of have interactions with what would be maybe her captors or her saviors, depending on how you look at it. But what's happened basically is there's this alien race that has seen the destruction or the imminent destruction of planet Earth. They've gone and they've picked up some of the survivors, and they have them in their ship, which is kind of a living ship, and this race is all kind of symbiotic assemblages of other beings, and they kind of have this trading system, and so much of their existence relies on exchanges with other species, and these exchanges, for these exchanges to happen, there needs to be this portal that I'm talking about with the face. There needs to be an opening, which I would also argue in our lives is the foundation of shared culture and shared social organizations. They can only happen through this metaphysical portal of the face that connects us beyond the level of sort of our personal models. But so in Octavia, in Dawn, Lilith is on board the spaceship. She doesn't know where she is. She's waiting to meet her captors. Finally, she wakes up and there's a figure which she describes as a. Actually, I'll find this. I'll find and I'll read this here. Yeah, there we go. I'll read my notes here. Lilith's first perceptual challenge. Well, no, I guess I'll give another couple sentences. So, the beginning of the story, it's really Octavia Butler's attempt to show that what is necessary is that we're able to integrate radically alien features into a coherent unity so that we can literally dwell in them or embody them in order to look from them, beyond them, to the interiority of the other that we're with. And this will connect us to Michael Polanyi's theory. But there's this important relationship of inattention, of a from-to awareness, that is all about integrating disparate aspects in a system in order to see that they have a meaning. But if you want to see that they have a meaning, you have to literally dwell in these aspects, embody them, make them invisible to you, make them tacit in order to see the meaning that is distal. And so for Lilith, she wakes up to this silhouette in her room, and it's this alien, and it kind of looks humanoid. But this alien species understands that the only way that they can connect with the humans is to gradually make them comfortable with one another. And there's such a sense of repulsion from the human to this alien face that has no facial features. And there's this whole process of having to sit together, and that the aliens know, the Oankali they're called, they know that there's a necessity for any exchange to happen, for any trade to happen. They know that they need to cultivate a shared ability to live in one another's facial features in order to attend to their interiorities. And then they can exchange meaningfully. And so Lilith's first perceptual challenge is to undo her assumption that the forms of Jediah, who's the name of the Oankali, the forms on Jediah's head are the equivalent to those of the human head. So these are some built-in assumptions. The sensory organs that shape the face of Jediah are clumps of hair-like tentacles, which do not function as eyes, ears, and a nose, but which Lilith immediately presumes are subtle clumps to be. The first task that Jediah gives to Lilith is to unsee the patterns she's projecting of eyes, ears, and nose on his face, and to see instead a different type of sensory organ by which to constitute the facial aspects she is looking for. This undoing quickly begins to simultaneously undo Lilith's familiarity with Jediah's silhouette. So when Jediah's first in there, she kind of describes it as seeing this humanoid silhouette, but the face is shaded, and she wants to see the person and connect with them. And she gets closer, and at first she sees these shadows as if there's eyes and a nose, and you wonder if they're projections. But when she gets in close, she realizes there are no eyes, there is no nose, and there's all these kind of fine little sensory tentacles all over their body. But the Oankali understand that despite that repulsion and total uncanniness, Lilith must be able to dwell in their facial features in order for them to exchange meaning. Because the ground of meaning exchange is the mutual recognition, or attending to, of their respective internalities. Lilith must see through their interiority by embodying it in order for her to share the meaning of their trade. So I'm going to just quickly talk about, I'll return to this, but this is a good moment to talk about. So we can picture this. Lilith wakes up, she's on an alien ship, there's this silhouette of a humanoid there, and she doesn't know where she is, and she goes, okay, and she has all these assumptions of the structure. And she says, okay, there's this person here, and I want to connect with them. And as she moves in closer, she's looking to integrate the assumed features of the face so that they can open up this metaphysical portal and have some sort of shared meaning. But those features aren't there. There's a new arrangement of features. I think this is a really beautiful way of sort of allegorically bringing up what Michael Polanyi wrote about, who is someone who I discovered through Alicia Herrero. He talks about the tacit dimension. And I'll just give a really quick one here. Basically, Michael Polanyi it's a model for attention that I think is super relevant right now, because it has to do with, the model it's a from to awareness. So anything that we are attending to, we have to dwell in what he calls the proximal, which is, it applies to media, applies to all kinds of things, text, ideas. Something is proximal, it's tacitly integrated into our body in order to attend to a distal meaning. There's an example that's a simple example of, like, if a blind person's using a cane, their attention is dwelling in the cane such that the cane is part of their perceptual apparatus. And the distal meaning is basically a mapping of the concrete or whatever the floor is. And a good way to understand this is that with a concept Polanyi calls destructive analysis, if their attention shifts to where their hand meets the cane, the meaning of the surface that they're trying to navigate disappears from view. This is the destructive analysis. Because they had were dwelling in the cane itself and where their hand encounters the cane in order to attend to the surface that they're meaningfully navigating. And so this kind of destructive analysis can show us sometimes what we are tacitly dwelling in order to attend to a distal meaning. There are other instances of this that Polanyi gives. I mean, in a lot of ways, his theory comes out of Gestalt perception. So if we understand the Gestalt as sort of a meaningful unity that, if perceived in terms of any of its parts, its individual parts, we lose sight of the meaningful unity. A melody is kind of the paradigmatic example of Gestalt, which Jan Zwicky writes about. I'm going to plug another book that I really liked called The Experience of Meaning by Jan Zwicky, a wonderful Canadian scholar and poet. So, you know, if you have this kind of awareness can be seen when you have a piano player playing a piece that they know so well, they are attending to the totality of that melody in the piece. And if their attention slips, and this happens all the time, I think it's happened to me a couple times up here, if their attention slips to their individual fingers and the keys, and these are called the subsidiaries in Polanyi's view. If it slips to the subsidiaries, what we're left with are these disparate parts, and these are the proximal aspects, and they're no longer integrated. So once our awareness shifts to the proximal, we lose sight of the distal meaning. This is the destructive analysis. It happens with language. Of course, it happens, we're probably all familiar with the experience of saying a word so many times that the materiality of the word, or if someone else is saying it, I've probably been saying constraint so much that the materiality of the word, it loses its meaning, and we're stuck kind of with the subsidiaries, the sounds and the lips and these kinds of things, and we lose the meaning. And in a lot of ways, this relates to the crisis of thermodynamics and what I talked about in the historical developments of modeling in sciences. Because this is as I said, this is a process of making the constituent parts, the most reducible aspects of a system, the real thing, and the emergent phenomena are thought of as being illusory, secondary, and they are excluded from the framework or the understanding of a system, life, other aspects. And so this is a form of systematic destructive analysis. And, um, and as we see in different aspects of the research, that, and Elisa Herrero is doing a really great job of this, of looking at how actually what's happening is when the integration of subsidiary parts to into emergent unities, coherences she calls it, gives rise to a kind of an interdependency or a meaning, a wholeness, a meaning to the wholeness of a system that actually, once established, becomes a causal factor in the system. In other words, if a bunch of constituent parts are moving about incoherently, they don't produce a unified meaning. But if they do produce a unified meaning, what can happen, and this gets talked about with dissipative systems and at all kinds of levels, if they create a coherent meaning, that coherent meaning is very much real ontologically, and it constrains the individual aspects of the system to keep producing the emergent meaning. This is a feedback loop. It's kind of when two causalities are going from bottom up and top down. And so in a lot of ways, this is expressed really well in theories of autopoiesis, which talk about like self-organization in living systems. So you would, if you were to use a strictly thermodynamic model, you would see constituent parts as always like these gases moving towards more and more dissipated, probabilistic distributions of states. But there's this phenomenon that happens where they can get into certain relations with one another that form these emergent totalities that are meaningful. And they're meaningful only in their interdependence, but that meaning keeps reproducing the states and the relations of the constituent parts. There's a really wonderful book, again, that I found through Alicia Herrero. I love plugging. She's a really incredible theorist. And she references another book by Matteo Massio and Alvaro Moreno. And it's called Biological Autonomy. And it's kind of it's a theory that goes beyond, it kind of builds on the autopoiesis concept, which is originally introduced by Maturana and Varela. And this interdependence and emergence is really important in their system, and I'll just take a moment to talk about that before I return to the difference between faces and images of faces. So in the theory, this builds on this kind of emergence of a causal regime that we would call a boundary condition or a top-down constraining causality. So in Moreno and Massio's theory of biological autonomy, they posit that what's happening is that a biological system is open thermodynamically. And we know this because all biological systems have metabolisms. They all are constantly taking in energy and aspects of order and organization from the environment and metabolically transforming them into state changes and using them and then excreting aspects to environment. And there's an openness. And then, of course, if we look at the Gaia hypothesis from Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock, we look at the Earth as this kind of emergent system of self-regulation and self-organization. But of course, it's thermodynamically open to the sun. It's where it gets all its energy. So it's not autonomous in the thermodynamic sense. And so just to be clear, Matteo Massio and Alvaro Moreno, their biological autonomy is very importantly not referring to thermodynamic autonomy, but it's talking about autonomy of constraints. And here's where I want to get back to, again, just keep circling around this point of an ontology of constraints that I think artists have been and are still always working on. There's an interdependency that emerges that is sort of, it exists in the Gestalt itself, and when you try to find the meaning by reducing the relationship or the aspects, the subsidiaries, taking them out of the system in isolation, and saying, oh, where does that meaning emerge? This happened with DNA in studies of living systems, trying to be like, oh, all the information that gives rise to the shape and the functional structure of a body, it's all this information that's reducibly found in the DNA. But we've found, and I'll talk more about something else right after this, where we can't do that, because when you take the the subsidiary, the aspects out of their context, we take them, we kind of do the destructive analysis, and we lose sight of the meaning, and we lose sight of the melody, and all of a sudden we're looking at our fingers, and we see part of the thermodynamic relationship, but we don't see how the constraint network produces a sort of meaning through interdependence. And I'll just quickly, so in biological autonomy, for example, there's an organological kind of dynamic in a body. So we're all made up of these separate organs. And you can't really look at biological systems without ascribing purposiveness or like a purpose to something. You want to say, okay, well, what is the liver? What is the liver? You can't talk about it in thermodynamic terms. You have to talk about its purpose in relation to, and this is something that we all know. Well, there might be people in this portal that haven't really thought about that, but I can feel that there's a relational kind of ontology out there. And the liver, then when we talk about that purposiveness, where is that purposiveness? Well, it's not in the liver itself, it's in the relation to the other organs. And what happens, the closure that is talked about through Moreno Macio and Alicia Herrero, and the autonomy, is the autonomy of interrelations. So if something happens, if the liver is not working properly, it's felt throughout the totality, because they're all connected, of course. And so the liver functioning well is sort of a meaning. It's a meaningful event or phenomenon that must be reproduced by all the other organs. And so there's a sense of like a meaning that is not objective and can't be found or distilled in the liver itself or the organ, but it's a meaning that is found in the totality in the interdependencies. I found this really beautiful 20-sided die that I thought was really beautiful. Is that showing up? And Jan's Wiki has a way of talking about this, sort of a way of thinking about the modeling gestalt in some way, or interdependencies, where the intersection of all these faces at every point, it's a dimensionless point. It's an intersection of the surfaces. And if you imagine that these were all made of some sort of malleable rubber, all the edges, if you pulled on any one of them, it would change the angles of all the triangles. Because when you start with a geodesic sphere like this, all of the angles have to be equal. But if you pull at one, you distort one angle, every single other angle of that geodesic sphere will have to be adjusted in that way. And so there's an interdependency there. And it's nice because it kind of, dice has to do with probabilities and entropy too. Because that interdependency, and now we can start to get to what science is talking about, how systems theory is talking about constraints in this way. Constraints in relation to entropy. If entropy is the measure of, the increase of entropy is sort of a physical system's tendency to move towards a maximum, the highest state distribution of its microstate. So diffusion, we can still use these colloquial words if we bracket them. Disorder, disorganization, spreading. That means that basically any of the subsystems, organs in a body, on their own, taken outside of the interdependent network of the body, they have all these, their possibility space is really big. And so possibility space is the concept that I think is super rich to find in aesthetics for. Because the possibility space is really big. So it can move the physical aspects of, let's say I pull some cell out of my body. It could go anywhere. But when it's in relation to all these other cells, its possibility space is constrained by its neighbors. And this we would call a negentropic effect. This is negentropy, when the possibility of where of how the system might unfold, it's entropic if it can go in all these different ways and to all these different places, and it has no constraints. But if it's unfolding in relation to an adjacent, meaningful other constituents, they constrain each other like a bunch of swallows flying in a big, beautiful swarm. there's one swallow alone in the sky, it might just be going flying all around. And so its possibility space is really big, and that's very entropic. And it can be beautiful because that can be associated with freedom and creativity, variability, chance, and we love all those things as artists. But we also, there's this beautiful balance where we can also set things in relation to one another where we limit their constraint, or their possibility space by setting them, let's say, like a swallow in relation to 2 or 3 other swallows. They're perceiving them, they're feeling the wind stream of the one ahead of it, and all of a sudden their possibility space, only through the experiential dimension of their interiority, are they limiting where they might go. And that's the principle of organization in biology. There's a really great, I'm going to wrap, I think I probably need to wrap it up pretty soon, is that right, Jay? I don't know where, there's just a couple cute little things I'll talk about, and then I'll avoid, yeah. Because I really haven't ruined my career yet by totally solidifying the difference between a face and an image of a face, and I want to do that. But before I say that, a recent, I'm just going to mention a recent paper that was published actually in January of this year by Gizem Gumaskaya, Michael Levin et al., a bunch of authors. But the paper is called Motile Living Biobot, Self-Construct from Adult Human Somatic Progenitor Seed Cells. Got a beautiful poetic ring. But what it's really talking about, well, let me quickly read the abstract. No, I'm not going to read the abstract because I think I need to move through things. I'll just tell you what I think it means. There's the introduction of something called an anthrobot. And this is sort of a form of biotechnology that is, once again, Octavia Butler's book Dawn is so beautifully kind of prophetic and like complicated, but everything is this biotech. And we've talked a little bit about that already. I haven't met any of you, so we haven't mentioned it, but we've talked about, you know, this kind of, the way biotechnology, what it's doing really is one system's noise or waste becomes another system's signal or organizational principle. And then so biotechnology is a hopeful place to go where we can not have this category of technological waste. So the anthrobot, though, is just to refer to this idea of possibility space, constraints, and what we can do with it. The anthrobots are introduced, a spheroid-shaped multicellular biological robot, a biobot platform, with diameters ranging from 30 to 500 microns, and cilia-powered locomotive abilities. Each anthrobot begins as a single cell derived from an adult human lung. And remember, it's ciliated. This is really important. It's derived from an adult human lung and self-constructs into a multicellular motile biobot after being cultured in extracellular matrix for 2 weeks. Anthrobots exhibit diverse behaviors with motility patterns ranging from tight loops to straight lines, speeds ranging from 5 to 50 microns per second, or I don't know if S1. So what these things are doing is, that's so exciting, is that just as I was saying in the biological autonomy framework, any little subsystem is going to have its own possibility space. And when you put it in relation, like a coherent relation to a bunch of other subsystems that have their own possibility space, through evolution, they form these kind of mutual constraining effects, which are felt meaningfully. It's a meaning that's derived out of interdependence and relation. So for the biobots, they come from a ciliated lung. Ciliated means like the kind of little hairs or whatever. So when they're taken out of the context of a human lung, within the lung, they have a very constrained and limited possibility space. They participate in this big system, which we can kind of feel if we use an analogy of like a social system. If we're in a group of people, like the way everybody is sitting in here, people who are watching from home are probably sprawling out. They probably have a much more diverse range of like sort of physical instantiations because they're not constrained by the presence of others. But here in the room, we have people sitting in a pretty orderly fashion, similar fashion. So your possibility space is constrained in all these different ways, experientially by the adjacent people. So when these biobots, basically the premise of this technology is taking them out of their context, but seeing what sort of that liberatory extraction gives rise to. And as they say here, it's the same source cell, but when it's taken out of its context, all of a sudden it has these different kind of like discrete patternings emerge. You get this looping, you get some that do this kind of straight lines, and the idea is that then you get this kind of repertoire, which we don't know exactly which one is going to do what, but eventually it becomes, the idea is that there's an advantage or an application in medical sciences that you can, in all kinds of ways, that you can kind of use this repertoire set of relations, kind of like a coding, which come out of their possibility space when removed from their constraint network. And I think in some ways that helps me think about how this idea of constraint and biological autonomy is being explored technologically in an interesting way. And I'm going to maybe just wrap it up, because that's something that I think people can go check out. There's some really great descriptions of this new project, and there's a lot of problems with it, of course. Places where it's super ripe for, I think, like theorizing and aestheticizing and exploration. Where is possibility space? Where are these constraints? Because they are, by definition, outside of the thermodynamic regime, but they have this effect. And Matteo Massio and Moreno and Alicia Herrero and others they describe them as existing at different time scales, so that like things are constrained because a system might be stable at one time scale, where another one is dynamic at its own time scale. So in some ways there's this sense of like a hyperdimensional relationship that is transcending time, or things are constraining across time. And we talked a little bit about that, actually. We talked about sort of this, I'm going to plug this. It was Maddie's idea of, for the listeners in this technological portal, the reversal of the skeuomorphic effect, right? Of like when a sort of a contingent or accidental aspect or function of a technology seems to become a necessity and pulls the evolution of the system in a certain direction. It's almost as if the meaning of that, or the entity in some way of that technology, is existing across time and pulling at the evolution in a present time. That's something I'm going to, leave a comment if you're interested in hearing more about that. I'll just finish though by talking about a beautiful example of introduced by someone who's been influential to me, is Lynn Margulis, she was a biologist and sort of incredible, just kind of polymath scientist who established, in a lot of ways, the theory of symbiogenesis. And I think just to tie this back to the bringing back a sense of an ontology of interiority to our understanding, our scientific understandings of the world, and which have been removed. I think Lynn Margulis's project should probably maybe reject this, but what she proposed is that and this is kind of a form of self-destructive analysis, looking at the animal cell, there's all these constituent parts within it. And the norms, the dogma of, or the paradigm of Darwinian evolution was all mutation from within, and then external environmental pressures, which are selectors, but all of the transformations happened as mutations and noise from within the system. And Margulis rejected this. And she saw a cell that others were taking for granted as being something that autonomously evolved over time to have all these constituent parts. What Margulis saw was, she saw the animal cell as being composed of a bunch of aspects which were once autonomous bacteria. So you had the big archaebacteria was sort of the cell body, and it was totally controversial at first, but now it's mostly accepted that, the mitochondria, which is sort of the metabolic engine of the cell, was once an autonomous bacterium, and there was a process of sort of parasitic, symbiotic indwelling that brought them together. And this becomes a radical shift in how evolution works, because there's a sense of sort of agency and intentionality in huge steps of evolutionary transformation. Because if it's all just blind mutation and environmental pressure, that's sort of just this mechanistic process that's already over with, even if we, in some theoretical sense. But Margulis proposed some sense that these bacteria, that there was a period there was a process of them sort of symbiotically, parasitically invading one another, coming to terms with one another, deciding to share a space with one another. And the one that she argues first happened, which still I don't think has been accepted into all the other features, constituents of the bacterium have been accepted as being once autonomously bacterial and then forming this symbiotic relationship, which is crazy, because then the cell all of a sudden, at some point, these things are reproducing separately, and then all of a sudden, because they're just invading each other and forming these weird, meaningful interdependencies so much, they just reproduce as a total unity. And there's something that doesn't quite make sense with our causal ontology. But the cilia, which are super important to this anthrobot, which I'm talking about, Margulis, in this very radical and psychedelic idea, proposed that these spirochete bacteria, which are kind of related to syphilis, and they're these spiral, free-swimming, snaky bacteria, was the first thing to invade the archaebacteria. And when it did that, it kind of would go and feed on these archaebacteria, and it got stuck. Its head would get stuck, and maybe it was a defense mechanism of the archaebacteria, but it absorbed the body into itself, and that became a source of motility. And so the possibility space of the spirochete on its own is like it thrashes around and can move on all these different ways. And then once it forms this interdependent union with the archaebacteria, that thrashing gets harnessed, instrumentalized, constrained, and they both sort of benefit, and they both form a new set of interdependencies that have this new meaningful, unity emerges. And from that, Margulis argues that there's a motility which emerges in an otherwise inert cell, and that increases the chances of the other bacterium sort of forming symbiotic relationships. So there's this really radical, strange, controversial kind of origin story from Margulis about like how the first constituents kind of like came together in the animal cell, and now we're seeing it come back in the anthrobots, which is really this beautiful thing, and it's funny that they're called anthrobots, and I'm not so utopian about it, but it's a beautiful illustration of this kind of like the way constraint and possibility space is such an important feature in the way we model our world and our biological systems and our relationships to things, and how there's these kind of gestalt interdependencies of constraint that form our meanings. It's a very rich place to go. I honestly, as you guys at home know, I could just talk about this stuff forever. But I know that there's probably metabolisms in the audience that need replenishing. There's probably a bunch of, well, let's just call it there. Thank you so much for listening here, and thank you at home. I hope you can take this distinction between the image of the face and the face itself and explore it further, because I think this will probably be my last public lecture ever. I think this has been a career suicide move, and so I appreciate you being here for this historic moment. Thank you very much. If people are up for it, certainly. Mm-hmm. I got the face? Oh, I got your face. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Is that sort of a delusion? Mm-hmm. Sorry, there were face filters, you said? What? That's weird, okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Let me see if I I felt like I was hearing you say something about there was these moments where the filters were interacting with what I was saying in a way that was meaningful, or that for you read visceral. Yeah. And then how did that connect to your sense of symbiosis? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That is actually something it's something that I've thought a lot about. I'd say actually that in my master's I was really looking more explicitly at that question of like when is the host a parasite, and when does the parasite become a host, and when does, and we talked a bit about Michel Serres and this book. I mean, in French there's a play, as there always is. The word, I think, for kind of static or noise is same as parasite. There's this kind of relationship there, and I totally am interested in this threshold of like, and I don't think you can totally determine it in any way other than just the. It might even be something that might be something that can't be taken outside of like the experiential, the affective, where it's in some ways I wanted to talk about the way that constraint interdependence can form. There's a way to kind of make a utopian model of that, where you could say, oh, all constraint networks or interdependencies of meaning, sort of like a coherent, harmonious cultural system, let's say, would be one that doesn't need to use any kind of like physical exploitation or oppression or like constraining by means of physical force or threat, violence, but is one where all the participants are constrained purely by the sense of meaning, that they are all participating meaningfully in something. This is this very kind of like one end of an extreme hypothetical where We might say like, well, I won't cross the street because I might get a ticket if it's not a green, and that's a constraint in a system that is sort of living through me because I don't want to get a ticket, because if I don't pay it, it ultimately gets reduced to this kind of like, at the bottom, there's a threat of physical violence in so many of these constraints. But then there's the kind of the reverse where you could be like, oh, I might not use cross the street because I don't know how I could conceive of that, but there are things that I certainly don't do that are constrained out of my possibility space. Alicia Herrera says like distorted, possibility space becomes distorted because they're meaningful to me, and I feel like this is a wonderful place where the face comes in. Because the more I see faces and I feel open to the interiority of others, and it's of course just called empathy, and I think faces, wherever they form, are kind of necessary for that portal. And that as a constraining factor could be where on the other end of the extreme, where it's like, if my possibility space is limited by my care for others and the meaning that I see in the emergent system that we're all participating in. And so I guess the host-parasite symbiosis threshold might be found somewhere in there, where you're saying like, if something is parasitic, it's sort of tricking another thing into forming an interdependency, but that host is sort of not benefiting from it and not feeling better about it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've thought about that. Oh, that's the visceral effect of the face filters. Yeah. Yeah, and that has to do a lot with, that opens up to definitely a strange, complicated problem of our globalized post-internet world, where we are trying to relate to one another. But if we think about the system of meanings as not being inherent, but not being illusory and fake, but being always context dependent, it's a way of talking about like intercultural relations, where a culture is formed and sustained through these cultural practices that themselves are not necessarily like the containers of meaning, but they are meaningful in relation to a set of other ongoing cultural practices. So the meaning isn't irrelevant or illusory, but it's also not objective and can't necessarily be communicated without communicating the totality of the cultural system in some way. So then when cultures come together, there's this kind of course, this ongoing crisis of trying to accept the validity of other cultural practices, when sometimes they look very similar to something that is a practice in our own kind of enculturation, which we have negative associations with, but that's just because we're transplanting the part into our own interdependent whole. And so that started to deviate, but I think just thinking about what face filters count as viscerally disturbing or whatever is totally becomes I like the word visceral, and I like the idea of like the necessity of that affective description in there for understanding and communicating these things, but then also understanding that like those things aren't viscerally disturbing to everyone or viscerally pleasing to everyone, because they're grounded in a set of relations. Yeah. Hey. Yes. Mhm. Mm.
When we look at a face in real life versus that image of the face and how undifferentiation can come into play there, but also like how that possibility space of the face changes when you see it in real life versus image.
Totally, yeah. So I used, yeah, and I kind of, it's a great question. I wanted to talk more about the face, the image of the face, and using this, I don't know, I tried to kind of summarize Michael Polanyi's theory of tacit attention, and it's really a way of thinking about how like disparate aspects of something can become unified coherently, they can produce coherence, but when they do that, I really love it. It's an early theory of sort of embodied cognition, where you kind of extend your own mental process into those subsidiaries and dwell in them, he uses the word dwell, in order to attend to something that is like the meaning of their totality. And that's the kind of the relationship to Gestalt. And with faces, I think there's a way of saying, okay, when we see a face, I integrate the facial features, and I think we probably all have people in our lives who there's sometimes just such a coherence and a frictionless relationship to their face that all the parts are in the right place and all their little expressions correspond to an interiority that we know so well and we kind of share, and they form intersubjectivities, that their facial features, if you were almost asked to describe them, it would be like, oh, I'd have to pull back and look at their face in these individual features, which is a sort of that destructive analysis of like losing a melody to like know what keys are being hit or whatever. So you could look at the history of like portraiture as a successful portrait in painting might be the thing that allows you to integrate features of a face as if there's an interiority. But there's always this kind of knowing that it's a flat surface, knowing there's not an agent there, but it evokes a response of like, oh, I see, through that, and there's this kind of, I feel it's as if there's an interiority there. But as I said, there's an interesting kind of parallel with like the entropy concept and the invention of, and the first photography portrait. And then where we get to now, we're just like, images of faces aren't produced at all on that basis of being like good or bad, because they open up, they evoke the sense as if there's an interiority there. And so there's this kind of systematic destructive analysis which happens through the proliferation of faces as images of faces, and a kind of, there's probably a threshold, but where we see more images of faces than faces themselves, as what I say are like a metaphysical entity of like interiority and the dimension at which you're meeting a mutual sense of attention. Because you can only attend to their interiority when you attend to the fact that what you're attending to is analogous to the thing that you are attending with. There's a strange looping where you just all of a sudden meet, and you can't always do that because it's exhausting actually in a lot of ways, I think, emotionally, to like enter into someone's interiority that way. But then I think it can also be thought of as a technique that could be lost of that kind of integration. There are lots of techniques that come and go, and if we look at, for example, the way that social media has made people hyper aware of their own and other facial features, and there's like this huge rise in like cosmetic surgery, because people are seeing themselves as images all the time, and when you're doing that, and others, and knowing that they're seen as, there's this strange thing, then all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, my nose is this thing that I'm seeing, because they're not integrating it into like, and seeing through it. There was a problem of AI generated police sketches. They were trying to develop a software to do like police sketching that was AI generated, but it was this problem because it was all, I think it's ongoing, but it's all based on inputting facial features first, and so asking you to kind of like look at these features separately, and then it generates this image that's so realistic that all of a sudden it's like printed, and then people kind of like are like, that becomes their new memory of it, which I don't know is a perfect example, but there does seem like there's examples of how images of the face because can start to be mistaken for what the face is, if that makes sense, and get in the way of, or just a reflexive kind of like relationship to images of faces kind of like, is like maybe atrophying or deteriorating our ability to kind of like attend to faces for what they might be as metaphysical portals to intersubjectivity, I might say. Yeah, or like a source of a center of attention that is only knowable through a sort of a looping back on your own process of attending to what that is, and so it can't be found in the parts. And this is why I relate it to kind of this crisis in like the reductionism of the history of Western science and through thermodynamics and modeling, is that like the ontological value is given to parts, and then that happens at different levels, and we start to like. And it can produce a lot, but it can produce a lot of toxicity too in technologies and everything. So, yeah, I think when that happens to faces, and it's not like a new thing either. I mean, it's totally a source of like othering. I think like, and this is where I bring in Octavia Butler's Dawn is like this radical, awesome, complicated example of such a radical other that knowing this alien knows that in order for them to have a meaningful exchange, they have to be able to dwell in their alien features in order to like live in it, to attend beyond it. And then, but we could see in the history of like racism that's ongoing and facial recognition technologies and stuff, there's like, if you have an idea of what that gets in the way of your relationship to someone else's interiority, all of a sudden their facial features are on display and they're totally in the way, and you take that for granted that that's just what their faces are like. But it's because you've had an ideological or sort of intervention on your ability to attend to their interiority, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, well, thanks for the question. Yeah. Lovely. Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone. Did I go way too long? I know that we started late too, so.
Full darkness back up again. Dan has to go.
So yeah, so I'm leaving now.
Thanks for coming.
I'll see you in Vancouver.
Oh, like you're flying back now?
Yeah.
Oh, the really nice thing about the options.
No.
Bye, Dan. It wasn't too long, or?
No, I mean, in this context, they can.
I know. Okay, cool.
And that, but it mean I have in a way, it's 1 hour long. We take it. I think it's about 1 hour. Just like that.
Okay.
Because I said, okay, well, somebody
But it was
called.
kind of running before I started too, right? Not for long. Okay, damn, that was
Oh,
long.
no, okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Mine was long.
I definitely
You beat me.
trimmed it down on the fly, but oh yeah, thanks. Thank you. Thanks so much.
My face filter is obviously really. Yeah.